several ways of explaining the attachment of infants to their primary caregiver, and one of these is called learning theory. Like most theories of attachment, learning theory focuses on the attachments of infants, but it can be at least partially applied to both animals and adults. Sometimes this theory has another name, and it's known as the behaviorist theory of attachment. It relies upon the material needs, the physical needs, food, warmth, shelter, of an infant being met. And this theory uses conditioning to explain why these attachments form. It's generally thought that there are two types of conditioning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We'll look at classical conditioning first. Classical conditioning is when the baby makes a mental link and begins to associate its mother with pleasure, with its physical needs being met. The mother of a baby, who is usually, as we've seen, the primary caregiver, but not always, provides basic material needs, like food, or warmth, or comfort, which brings pleasure to the baby as these basic material needs are met. The baby or infant therefore forms an attachment to the mother. It feels pleasure whenever the mother is present to feed it, comfort it, or keep it warm. This is known as classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is similar but slightly different. In many ways, it's a negative version of classical conditioning. It's the same process, but working in reverse to a similar effect. The infant no longer has its needs met once the mother departs and is no longer present. Those basic physical needs like food, shelter, and warmth are no longer being satisfied when the mother or other primary caregiver is no longer present. When this primary caregiver, usually the mother, comes back, this discomfort is removed. Sometimes this is known as negative reinforcement, but it is a type of conditioning. It's a negative or opposite version of positive classical conditioning, and this is known as operant conditioning. Psychology has a lot of theoretical explanations for behavior, like learning theory. And like most of them, learning theory is not universally accepted. It has both advantages, good points, and some disadvantages, points which take away from it. There is a large amount of general scientific research which provides evidence for learning theory. This research has been rigorous, it's usually been under laboratory conditions with good control of variables, and is often repeatable and peer review. It is proper, full scientific research which supports learning theory. Because large amounts of this research was done in a laboratory setting or involving animals, it might not be possible to generalize it to human infants. It might have limited ecological validity. We've already seen when we looked at animal research that you often cannot generalize the results and conclusions you find to human infants. They behave differently. And this is the same with learning theory. It may have been observed in animals, but that doesn't mean it's going to be observed in humans. A major criticism is that learning theory is reductionist. When we say reductionist, what we mean is that it tries to explain a complex and involved process that happens over a long period of time by reducing it to very simplistic interactions. It effectively tries to take the long and complex process of forming attachments as an infant and put them into a basic flowchart. Many people take an issue with this, as a simple theory can never explain a very complex process. Some studies that have been done on attachment don't support learning theory either. However, many of these studies don't take the mother to be the primary caregiver, whereas learning theory really assumes that. It assumes a mother figure who is meeting the basic physical needs of the child. A positive, however, is that learning theory is relatively simple. It can be easily understood by students and, importantly, by the wider population at large. It makes it useful for things like training and teaching purposes, and makes it useful in explaining the behavior of infants to people like politicians and civil servants. In 1951, a psychologist called Bowlby developed an alternative theory of attachment in humans as an alternative to learning theory, which, as we've already seen, does have some problems. This was called the monotropic theory of attachment, and it's based on a biological process. It's based on evolution. In being based on evolution, it seeks to explain the behavior of human infants in that context of evolution, how our development as a species has programmed us to form attachments in certain given ways. The behavior of infants in this evolutionary context usually has a very simple, very clear purpose. As with all evolution, adaptations and behavior is there to maximize our chances of survival, and therefore our chances of procreation and continuing the species. Bowlby argued that something resembling imprinting does happen with human infants. Imprinting is something that we've already seen in goslings, but Bowlby was arguing that it happens in human infants too. However, Bowlby argued that this process is much more complex than it is with animals. Bowlby made 4 main claims in his theory, and therefore there are 4 parts to Bowlby's monotropic theory. The first part is that evolution provides a coherent explanation for attachment. The process of evolution means that species gradually adapt their physical properties and their behavior to maximize their competition and their chances of survival, to try and outcompete people both within the species, but also outcompete other animals around them and have the greatest chance of survival in their given environment. Infants that form a strong and secure attachment to their main caregiver are much more likely to survive than those that do not. They'll have their basic physical needs as a baby met. They'll be cared for, looked after, and get food and shelter. This will increase vastly their chances of survival. Therefore, these individuals that survive because they form a secure attachment are much more likely to breed. They're going to be able to make children themselves. And this will pass on the genetic information which carries this behavior. It will carry on these genotypes, as they're called, which determine this behavior of forming an attachment. Over time, if we repeat this generation after generation after generation, strong and secure attachment in infants becomes embedded in the evolutionary behavior of the species. It becomes dominant and it becomes widespread. The second claim in Bowlby's monotropic theory was that we create one special attachment as an infant. In fact, the word monotropic means one critical, important, main attachment. The theory goes that usually this is to our biological mother, because that is the single attachment which is most likely to secure our continued survival. A strong attachment to our biological mother means that most of our basic needs are being met. We'll be fed, we'll be warm, we'll be clothed, we'll be catered for, we'll be sheltered. This strong attachment, therefore, provides a secure base from which the infant can begin to explore their environment. This attachment provides a basis from which they can safely begin to adapt to the environment around them. The third claim in Bowlby's monotropic theory was that we create an internal working model of attachment. Bowlby argued that the swift creation after birth of a single important main attachment to a caregiver becomes a template for us. It influences us by providing an internal working model of attachment. This internal model influences on how we form attachments and relationships in later life, be that as a slightly older infant or in adulthood. And this internal model is a working one. It changes and it adapts to our experiences over time. Our experiences cause us to change our expectations of what attachments are like. Therefore, the initial attachment with a single critical primary caregiver provides a model for the rest of the attachments that we will form as we get older, through childhood and then into adulthood. Sometimes this is known as the continuity hypothesis, the idea that this internal model is a working one and can change and adapt based on our continued experiences. The fourth and final claim in Bowlby's monotropic theory was this: that there is a limited critical period for infants forming attachments, a time period after birth, which is a critical period for the formation of that single, sole, strong attachment. Specifically, Bowlby claimed that this was the first 3 years of life, and that these first 3 years are the critical period. If an infant doesn't form a single, strong attachment in this period, then they may never form one at all at any point in their later life, which will have significant consequences for the quality of that later life. There are all sorts of reasons why this attachment might not develop. It might be that the child has been removed from the parents, or that the parents have been removed from the child. It might be the death of a caregiver, so they have to be brought up by a more distant relative, for example. There are a range of reasons. Should this attachment not develop as it should do in this first critical 3 years, then it's likely that the infant will go on to develop social, emotional, and mental health problems. Social problems are issues interacting with peers in a normal, socially acceptable way. Emotional issues are problems in regulating, expressing, and understanding emotion, and mental health problems can include sociopathy or aggression. Bowlby developed as an explanation of this the maternal deprivation hypothesis. This hypothesis stated that if the infant-mother relationship was disrupted or even prevented in early life, there would be significant consequences for the infant in their later life as an old child or as... There are many points to consider when we evaluate Bowlby's theory. It is supported by a large amount of lab research and previous studies, such as the one we've already seen about Harlow and his use of monkeys. In particular, all of this research supports the ideas that the theory puts forward about the consequences of not forming attachment. Obviously, separate research done outside of psychology in evolutionary biology supports the evolutionary part of Bowlby's theory, and the two match up very well. But large amounts of all this research that's been done has used animals. We've already looked at the large ethical problems of animals, but another issue is that it all has limited ecological validity. It can't even be generalized to other animals, or even animals within the same species, never mind to humans. And there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the findings from monkeys or other animals would apply to human infants. Schaffer and Emerson, as we've already seen in 1964, found evidence that children can form many attachments. This directly contradicts Bowlby's theory. Bowlby put forward the idea that infants form one sole important attachment, but Schaffer and Emerson found evidence that they can form multiple attachments. Harlow's study also came up with additional problems. It found that monkeys who grew up together but without their mother developed no social or emotional problems in later life. This also directly contradicted Bowlby's theory. Bowlby's theory held that if they grew up without their mother, they would have problems, but Harlow's study using monkeys directly contradicted this. The critical period of attachment, which Bowlby said was the first 3 years, also has some but very limited evidence. Some studies have found no evidence of this at all, some have been inconclusive, and some have found that the time period of 3 years is actually shorter or longer than it should be. There were, unfortunately, a lot of consequences to wider society of Bowlby's theory. Its publication in 1951 led to a lot of mothers staying in the home out of fear that their child would develop these social, emotional, or mental health problems. They did this instead of taking up careers. This process delayed the equality of women in wider society by many years. As we've already seen, there are 3 main types of attachment. The first of these is secure attachment. Sometimes this is also known as type B attachment. This is a strong emotional bond between the infant and their primary caregiver, which, as we've also seen, will usually but not always be the biological mother. The infant, in this case, usually derives material and emotional pleasure from being close to their caregiver, and these types of attachments are critical for the healthy social and emotional development of the child. Some theories have put forward the idea that these types of type B secure attachments are even critical for the physical development of the child. The second type of attachment is known as insecure avoidant, sometimes also known as type A attachment. In this type of attachment, the infant avoids forming strong emotional bonds. They don't happen. If their caregiver is then removed, they don't show any strong emotion. They don't show any distress or discomfort, and usually even a complete stranger can calm or comfort the infant. They don't have that single, sole, exclusive bond with a primary caregiver. These children and infants will generally show some social isolation, and they'll also avoid intimacy with others. The third type of attachment, sometimes known as type C, is called insecure resistant. This is a more complex form of attachment, where children usually become upset if they're separated from their caregiver, as is normal and as we would expect in healthy, secure attachment relationships. But the difference is, firstly, that they resist any comfort by strangers or by that caregiver when they return. They start to resist that attachment. They are insecure and resistant in that relationship. Children who show this type of attachment will often grow to both reject and accept social interaction and intimacy, and their emotional and social development can be complex and abnormal. In 1978, Ainsworth, leading a group of researchers, developed the idea of the strange situation. This was placing children in a new and possibly stressful situation, often with a stranger, somebody who they didn't know and didn't have an attachment to see how these children would react. Given that children were involved, this was a laboratory experiment, and it was done under carefully controlled conditions. A group of 12 to 18-month-old infants were chosen. They were from a range of backgrounds and cultures, and they were a reasonable mix of genders. Each child was placed in a room with their mother, who in each of these scenarios was their primary caregiver. 3 different scenarios were then played out, and the reactions of the infants, both socially and emotionally, and even their displayed emotions, were directly observed by researchers. The first of these scenarios was that the child was approached by a stranger, somebody who they didn't know and was strange to them. The second scenario was that the mother departed and left the child in the room. The primary caregiver has been removed. And the third scenario was that that mother, that primary caregiver, was then returned to the child and they were reunited. It was found with these scenarios that roughly 15% of the children were insecure avoidant. They ignored their mother and didn't seem distressed or angry if the mother, who was the primary caregiver, left. They would accept comfort from a stranger. Roughly 70%, the vast majority, as one would expect, were securely attached, the social norm. They showed distress or anger when their mother was removed, and they were happy and relieved to see her return slightly later. The remaining 15% were insecure resistant. They showed no strong attachment to their mother, but they were at least uneasy or a bit displeased when she was removed and left, and when that primary caregiver was removed from the scenario. They couldn't be comforted by strangers, and critically, they showed little pleasure or relief upon the return of their mother. The main conclusion drawn from this piece of strange situation research was that children showing different reactions to the presence and absence of their mother, and indeed the presence of strangers, have these different types of attachment: type A, type B, or type C. That is secure, insecure resistant, or insecure avoidant. As we've already seen, this research was done under close laboratory conditions and properly supervised, so there was very good control of the variables, and a cause-effect relationship could be established. But as this study didn't occur in the real world and the children weren't in their natural setting, there was limited ecological validity. It's entirely impossible to say that these results could be generalized outside of the laboratory. Outside of this specific and very artificial setting, it's entirely possible that infants might react in completely different ways to strange situations. It's also possible, and it's even likely, that there may well have been an observer effect. Firstly, the parents knew they were being studied, so they might have changed their behavior to conform to what they felt was expected of them. The presence of the observer, even if they weren't directly in the room, may also have affected the interactions of the infant. It's impossible to know in this scenario to what extent there was an observer effect. It's also possible that in some cases, the mother may not have been the main attachment figure. It might not be the mother that infant had a secure attachment to. For some of the children, this would complicate the results. It would make some of the results anomalous and invalid, and that would have to be taken into account when analysis was done on the data. Lastly, and perhaps most obviously, there is a huge ethical issue with this research. Infants and small children don't understand what's happening around them. They're completely unable to give any kind of informed consent. Several of them were subjected to stress or unhappiness upon the removal of the mother, and it's possible this may have caused them emotional distress at the time or in later life, or even mental health problems. Van Eisendoorn and Cronenberg in 1988 advanced this research to look further into how children react and different types of attachment. Mostly they looked at earlier strange situations studies. Therefore, this research was a piece of what we call meta-analysis. Another way of putting that is that it was studies done on many other studies to collate them and try and find overall or general trends and patterns in that huge amount of data. Most of that data would have been quantitative, it would have been numbers-based, but some of it may have been qualitative, it may have been textual. A total of over 30 studies, around about 32, 33, were looked at, and they'd all been done over the previous few decades, roughly from World War II in 1945 through to the early 1980s, when higher ethical standards meant that progressively less and less studies on attachment in animals and children were done. In particular, what the researchers were looking for were patterns between different cultures and different countries. This could be differences or similarities in those cultures and countries. The percentages of children who showed those different types of attachment, those being secure, insecure resistant, and insecure avoidant, were roughly constant. They stayed about the same from country to country, and therefore from culture to culture. Somewhat unexpectedly, however, there were some differences within countries themselves, especially between different areas in the country, but also between different socioeconomic groups. When we say socioeconomic groups, we effectively mean class, the wealth and social patterns of a group. As we may expect, the most common type of attachment was secure. The most common type of insecure attachment actually varied, however, in different countries. Westernized nations like the US, Canada, and the UK generally showed more insecure avoidant, while Eastern nations such as China, Malaysia, and especially Japan showed more insecure resistant. There were several conclusions that could be drawn from this research. The main conclusion drawn was that there are similarities in attachment and in raising children throughout different cultures and throughout different countries. There seem to be constants in every country and every culture as to how children are raised and how they form attachments. A second conclusion was that children in a range of cultures react in similar ways to these new or strange situations, and that also seemed to be a constant across countries and across cultures. Being meta-analysis, as we've already discussed, the evaluation points for this research are almost a composite of evaluations of the individual research. If there were ethical issues in the individual research, there will be ethical issues in the meta-analysis. Both the advantages and the problems carry over. The ecological validity of this research, therefore, is only as good as the actual ecological validity of the initial research on which it was based. Most of the time, this was all done under laboratory conditions, and therefore that ecological validity is, at best, limited. There are no ethical issues specific to this piece of research, but a lot of the initial research done was on children. And as we know, children are completely unable to give any kind of informed consent. So this study effectively inherits the ethical issues inherent in previous studies. It carries over. All of the studies used for this research used the strange situation method, putting children, usually with a primary caregiver, in a new and strange situation. Had a different type of study been done or a different type of study been used, that may have produced completely different results with completely different conclusions. And lastly, not all countries, and therefore not all cultures, were studied in this meta-analysis. Only about 60 were looked at, so therefore there might be exceptions that we don't know about to the general trends. As we've already seen, there's been lots and lots of different studies done that have used this strange situation idea, this idea of putting children in a new or strange or unfamiliar situation to try and draw some conclusions about their attachment and the type of attachment they have to their primary caregiver. From all these studies, there have been several general conclusions drawn. Some cultural differences are present. To give an example, Grossman and his team of researchers in 1984 found that both children and parents in Germany especially, which then would have been West Germany, valued independence more than in other similar countries like France and the UK. This changed how attachment was formed. A second conclusion was that these studies identified types of attachment, but they didn't actually provide any conclusive evidence on the actual cause of attachment. That is still open for debate and is a key topic in debate in psychology. A third conclusion was this: the strange situation idea and model is quite limited. It only really applies in the early development of the child, and it doesn't really work when the child is older and can make sense of what's happening. It also doesn't look at how they deal with multiple attachments, and we've already seen how children can form multiple attachments. A fourth conclusion, and an important one, is that attachment may influence later behavior and traits. It's already been theorized that each of the three types of attachment we've seen and looked at leads to different later behavior in children and how they will act as adults. The general consensus is usually this: those children who at an early age show a secure attachment will generally later in life show healthy social and emotional relationships when they're older. Those who show insecure resistant attachment may show some insecurity and an overbearing need for attention. This can lead to social and relationship difficulties in that later life. And lastly and thirdly, those showing insecure avoidant attachment might show serious behavioral issues and have very serious problems forming healthy relationships in later life.